Hi, welcome back. So I'm going to be continuing the Communist Manifesto from the start of Part 3, Socialist and Communist Literature. Once again, I'm reading from the PDF from Marxist.org, which you can get for free, and I'll link it down below. So Part 1a, Reactionary Socialism, Feudal Socialism. Owing to their historical position, it became the vocation of the aristocracies of France and England to write pamphlets against modern bourgeois society. In the French Revolution of July 1830 and in the English Reform agitation, these aristocracies again succumbed to the hateful upstart. Thenceforth, a serious political struggle was altogether out of the question. A literary battle alone remained possible. But even in the domain of literature, the old cries of the Restoration period had become impossible. In order to arouse sympathy, the aristocracy was obliged to lose sight, apparently, of its own interests, and to formulate their indictment against the bourgeois in the interest of the exploited working class alone. Thus, the aristocracy took their revenge by singing lampoons on their new masters and whispering in the ears sinister prophecies of coming catastrophe. In this way arose feudal socialism, half lamentation, half lampoon, half an echo of the past, half menace of the future, at times, by its bitter, witty, and incisive criticism, striking the bourgeoisie to the very heart's core, but always ludicrous in its effect, through total incapacity to comprehend the march of modern history. The aristocracy, in order to rally the people to them, waved the proletarian alms-bag in front for the banner. But the people, so often as it joined them, saw on their hindquarters the old feudal coats of arms, and deserted with loud and irreverent laughter. One section of the French Legitimists and the quote-unquote Young England exhibited this spectacle. In pointing out that their mode of exploitation was different than to that of the bourgeoisie, the feudalists forgot that they exploited under these circumstances and conditions that were quite different to that of the bourgeoisie. The feudalists forget that they exploited under circumstances and conditions that were quite different and that are now antiquated. In showing that, under their rule, the modern proletariat never existed, they forget that the modern bourgeoisie is the necessary offspring for their own form of society. For the rest, so little do they conceal the reactionary character of their criticism, that their chief accusation against the bourgeois amounts to this, that under the bourgeois regime, a class is being developed which is destined to cut and uproot and branch the old order of society. What they upbraid the bourgeoisie with is not so much that it creates as a proletariat as that it creates a revolutionary proletariat. In political practice, therefore, they can join all coercive measures against the working class, and in ordinary life, despite their highfalutin phrases, they stoop to pick up the golden apples dropped from the tree of industry, and to barter truth, love, and honor for traffic in wool, beetroot, sugar, and potato spirits. As the parson has ever gone hand in hand with the landlord, so has the cleric socialism with the feudal socialism. Nothing is easier than to give Christian asceticism a socialist tinge. Has Christianity declaimed against private property, against marriage, against the state? Has it not preached in the place of these charity and poverty, celibacy and mortification of the flesh, monastic life, and mother church? Christian socialism is but the holy water with which the priest consecrates the heart-burnings of the aristocrat. Alright, now on to Part 1b, Petty Bourgeois Socialism. The feudal aristocracy was not the only class that was ruined by the bourgeoisie, not the only class whose conditions of existence pinned and perished the atmosphere of the modern bourgeois society. The medieval burgess and the small peasant proprietors were the precursors of the modern bourgeoisie. In those countries which are but little developed industrially and commercially, these two classes still vegetate side by side with the rising bourgeoisie. In countries where modern civilization has become fully developed, a new class of petty bourgeois has been formed, fluctuating between proletariat and bourgeoisie, and ever renewing itself as a supplementary part of bourgeois society. The individual members of this class, however, are being constantly hurled down into the proletariat by action of competition, and as modern industry develops, they even see the moment approaching when they will completely disappear as an independent section of modern society, to be replaced in manufactures, agriculture, and commerce by overlookers, bailiffs, and shopmen. In countries like France, where the peasants constitute far more than half of the population, it was natural that writers who sided with the proletariat against the bourgeoisie should use, in their criticism of the bourgeois regime, the standard of the peasant and petty bourgeois, and from their standpoint of these intermediate classes, should take up the cudgels for the working class. Thus arose petty bourgeois socialism. Sismondi was the head of this school not only in France but also in England. This school of socialism dissected with great acuteness the contradictions in the conditions of modern production. It laid bare the hypocritical apologies of economists. It proved incontrovertibly the disastrous effects of machinery and division of labor, the concentration of capital and land in a few hands, overproduction and crises. It pointed out the inevitable ruin of the petty bourgeois and the peasant, the misery of the proletariat, the anarchy in production, the crying inequities in the distribution of wealth, the industrial war of extermination between nations, the dissolution of old moral bonds, of the old family relations, of the old nationalities. In its positive aims, however, this form of socialism aspires either to restoring the old means of production and of exchange, and with them the old property relations and the old society, or to cramping the modern means of production and of exchange within the framework of the old property relations that have been, and were bound to be, exploded by those means. In either case, it is both reactionary and utopian. In its last words are corporate guilds for manufacture, patriarchal relations in agriculture. Ultimately, when stubborn historical facts had dispersed all intoxicating effects of self-deception, this form of socialism ended in a miserable fit of the blues. So now for part 1C, German or quote-unquote true socialism. The socialist and communist literature of France, a literature that originated under the pressure of a bourgeoisie in power, and that was the expressions of the struggle against this power, was introduced into Germany at the time when the bourgeoisie in that country had just begun its contest with feudal absolutism. German philosophers, would-be philosophers, and beaux esprits, or men of letters, eagerly seized on this literature, only forgetting that when these writings immigrated from France into Germany, French social conditions had not immigrated along with them. In contact with German social conditions, this French literature lost all its immediate practical significance and assumed a purely literary aspect. Thus, to the German philosophers of the 18th century, the demands of the First French Revolution were nothing more than the demands of the quote-unquote practical reason in general, and the utterance of the will of the revolutionary French bourgeoisie signified, in their eyes, the laws of the pure will, of will as it was bound to be, of true human will generally. The work of the German literati consisted solely in bringing the new French ideas into harmony with their ancient philosophical conscience, or rather, in annexing the French ideas without deserting their own philosophic point of view. This annexation took place in the same way in which a foreign language is appropriated, namely by translation. It is well known how the monks wrote silly lives of Catholic saints over the manuscripts on which the classical works of ancient heathendom had been written. The German literati reversed this process with the profane French literature. They wrote their philosophical nonsense beneath the French original. For instance, beneath the French criticism of the economic functions of money, they wrote, quote-unquote, alienation of humanity, and beneath the French criticism of the bourgeois state they wrote, quote, dethronement of the category of the general, and so forth. The introduction of these philosophical phrases at the back of the French historical criticisms they dubbed, quote, philosophy of action, quote, true socialism, quote, German science of socialism, quote, philosophical foundations of socialism, and so on. The French socialist and German literature was thus completely emasculated, and since it ceased in the hands of the German to express the struggle of one class with the other, he felt conscious of having to overcome, quote, French one-sidedness, and of representing not true requirements, but having the requirements of truth, not the interests of the proletariat, but the interests of human nature, of man in general, who belongs to no class, has no reality, who exists only in the misty realm of philosophical fantasy. This German socialism, which took its schoolboy task so seriously and solemnly, and exploited its poor stock in trade in such a mountebank fashion, meanwhile gradually lost its pedantic innocence. The fight of the Germans, and especially of the Prussian bourgeoisie, against feudal aristocracy and absolute monarchy, in other words, the liberal movement, became more earnest. By this, the long-wished-for opportunity was offered to, quote-unquote, true socialism, of confronting the political movement with the social demands, of hurling the traditional anathemas against liberalism, against representative government, against bourgeois competition, bourgeois freedom of the press, bourgeois legislation, bourgeois liberty and equality, and of preaching to the masses that they had nothing to gain and everything to lose by this bourgeois movement. German socialism forgot, in the nick of time, that the French criticism, whose silly echo it was, presupposed the existence of modern bourgeois society, with its corresponding economic conditions of existence and the political constitution adapted thereto, the very things those attainment was the object of the pending struggle in Germany. To the absolute governments, with their following of parsons, professors, country squires, and officials, it served as a welcome scarecrow against the threatening bourgeoisie. It was a sweet finish after the bitter pills of flogging and bullets with which these same governments just at the time dosed the German working class risings. While this true socialism thus served the government as a weapon for fighting the German bourgeoisie, it at the time directly represented a reactionary interest, the interest of the German Philistines. In Germany, the petty bourgeois class, a relic of the 16th century, and since then constantly cropping up against their various forms, is the real social basis of the existing state of things. To preserve this class is to preserve the existing state of things in Germany. The industrial and political supremacy of the bourgeoisie threatens it with certain destruction, on the one hand, from the concentration of capital, on the other, from the rise of a revolutionary proletariat. Quote-unquote, true socialism appeared to kill these two birds with one stone. It spread like an epidemic. The robe of speculative cobwebs, embroidered with flowers of rhetoric, steeped in the dew of sickly sentiment, with this transcendental robe in which the German socialists wrapped their sorry, quote-unquote, eternal truths, all skin and bone, served to wonderfully increase the sale of their goods amongst such a public. And on its part, German socialism recognized more and more its own calling as the bombastic representative of the petty bourgeois Philistine. It proclaimed the German nation to be a model nation, and the German petty Philistine to be the typical man. To every villainous meanness and this model man, it gave a hidden, higher, socialistic interpretation, the exact contrary of its real character. It went to extreme length of directly opposing the quote-unquote brutally deconstructive tendency of communism, and of proclaiming its supreme and impartial contempt of all class struggles. With very few exceptions, all the so-called socialist and communist publications that now, 1847, circulate in Germany belong to the domain of this foul and unnerving literature. Alright, so now on to part 2, conservative or bourgeois socialism. A part of the bourgeoisie is desirous of redressing social grievances in order to secure the continued existence of bourgeois society. To this section belongs economists, philanthropists, humanitarians, improvers of the condition of the working class, organizers of charity, members of society for the prevention of cruelty to animals, temperance fanatics, hole and corner reformers of every imaginable kind. This form of socialism has, moreover, been worked out into complete systems. We might cite Proudhon's Philosophie de la Misère as an example of this form. The socialistic bourgeois want all the advantages of modern social conditions without the struggles and dangers necessarily resulting therefrom. They desire the existing state of society, minus its revolutionary and disintegrating elements. They wish for a bourgeoisie without a proletariat. The bourgeoisie naturally conceives the world in which it is supreme to be the best, and bourgeois socialism develops this comfortable conception into various more or less complete systems. In requiring the proletariat to carry out such a system, and thereby to march straightway into the social New Jerusalem, it but requires in reality that the proletariat should remain within the bounds of existing society, but should cast away all its hateful ideas concerning the bourgeoisie. A second and more practical but less systematic form of this socialism sought to deprecate every revolutionary movement in the eyes of the working class by showing that no mere political reform, but only a change in the material conditions of existence, in economical relations, could be of any advantage to them. By changes in the material conditions of existence, this form of socialism, however, by no means understands abolition of the bourgeois relations of production, an abolition that can be effected by a revolution, but administrative reforms based on the continued existence of these relations. Reforms, therefore, that in no respect affect the relations between capital and labor, but at the best lessen the cost and simplify the administrative work of bourgeois government. Bourgeois socialism attains adequate expression when and only when it becomes a mere figure of speech. Free trade for the benefit of the working class, protective duties for the benefit of the working class, prison reform for the benefit of the working class. This is the last word and the only serious meant word of bourgeois socialism. It is summed up in the phrase, "The bourgeois is a bourgeois for the benefit of the working class." And now on to part 3, critical utopian socialism and communism. We do not here refer to that literature which, in every great modern revolution, has always given voice to the demands of the proletariat, such as the writings of Babeuf and others. The first direct attempts of the proletariat to attain its own ends, made in times of universal excitement when feudal society was being overthrown, necessarily failed, owing to then undeveloped state of the proletariat, as well as to the absence of the economic conditions for its emancipation, conditions that had yet to be produced, and could be produced by the impending bourgeois epoch alone. The revolutionary literature that accompanied these first movements of the proletariat had necessarily a reactionary character. It included universal asceticism and social leveling in the crudest form. The socialist and communist systems, properly so called, those of Saint Simon, Fourier, Owen, and others, spring into existence in the early undeveloped period described above. Of the struggle between the proletariat and bourgeoisie, see Section 1, Bourgeois and Proletariats, the founders of these systems see, indeed, the class antagonisms, as well as the action of decomposing elements in the prevailing form of society. But the proletariat, as yet in its infancy, offers them the spectacle of class without any historical initiative or any independent political movement. Since the development of class antagonism keeps even pace with the development of industry, the economic situation, as they find it, does not yet offer them the material conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. They therefore search after a new social science, after a new social laws that are to create these conditions. Historical action is to yield to their personal incentive action. Historically created conditions of emancipation to fantastic ones, and the gradual spontaneous class organization of the proletariat to an organization of society, especially contrived for these inventors. Future history resolves itself in their eyes into the propagation and the practical carrying out of their social plans. In the formation of their plans, they are conscious of caring chiefly for the interests of the working class, as being the most suffering class. Only from the point of view of being the most suffering class does the proletariat exist for them. The undeveloped state of the class struggle, as well as their own surroundings, causes socialists of this kind to consider themselves far superior to all class antagonisms. They want to improve the condition of every member of society, even that of the most favored. Hence, they habitually appeal to society at large, without the distinction of class, nay, by preference, to the ruling class. For how can people, when once they understand their system, fail to see it in the best possible plan of the best possible state of society? Hence, they reject all political, and especially all revolutionary action they wish to attain their ends by peaceful means, necessarily doomed to failure, and by the force of example to pave their way for the new social gospel. Such fantastic pictures of future society, painted at the time when a proletariat is still in a very undeveloped state and has but a fantastic conception of its own position, correspond with the first instinctive yearnings, that of a class, for a general reconstruction of society. But these socialist and communist publications contain also a critical element. They attack every principle of existing society. Hence, they are full of the most valuable materials for the enlightenment of the working class. The practical measures proposed in them, such as the abolition of the distinction between town and country, of the family, of the carrying out on industries for the account of private individuals, and of the wage system, the proclamation of social harmony, the conversion of the function of the state into a more superintendence of production, all of these proposals point solely to the disappearance of class antagonisms, which were at the time only just cropping up, and which in these publications are recognized in their earliest indistinct and undefined forms only. These proposals, therefore, are of a purely utopian character. The significance of critical utopian socialism and communism bears an inverse relation to historical development. In proportion as the modern class struggle develops and takes definite shape, this fantastic standing apart from the contest, these fantastic attacks on it, lose all practical value and theoretical justification. Therefore, although the originators of these systems were, in many respects, revolutionary, their disciples have, in every case, formed mere reactionary sects. They hold fast the original views of their master, in opposition to the progressive historical development of the proletariat. They, therefore, endeavor, and that consisted to deaden the class struggle and to reconcile the class antagonisms. They still dream of experimental realization of their social utopias, of founding isolated quote-unquote phalansteres, of establishing quote-unquote home colonies, or setting up a quote-unquote Little Icaria, 12th editions of the New Jerusalem, and to realize all these castles in the air, they are compelled to appeal to the feelings and purses of the bourgeois. By degrees, they sink into the category of the reactionary or conservative socialists depicted above, differing from these only by more systematic pedantry, and by their fanatical and superstitious belief in the miraculous effect of their social science. They, therefore, violently oppose all political action on the part of the working class. Such action, according to them, can only result from blind unbelief in the new gospel. The Owenites in England and the Fourierists in France respectively opposed the Chartists and the Réformistes. All right, now into part 4. Position of the communists in relation to the various existing opposition parties. Section 2 made clear the relations of the communists to the existing working class parties, such as the Chartists in England and the agrarian reformers in America. The communists fight for the attainment of the immediate aims, for the enforcement of momentary interests of the working class. But in the movement of the present, they also represent and take care of the future of that movement. In France, the communists ally with the Social Democrats against the conservative and radical bourgeoisie, reserving, however, the right to take up a critical position in regard to phases and illusions traditionally handed down from the Great Revolution. In Switzerland, they support the radicals without losing sight of the fact that this party consists of antagonistic elements, partially of democratic socialists in the French sense, partially of radical bourgeois. In Poland, they support the party that insists on the agrarian revolution as the prime condition for the national emancipation, that party which fomented the insurrection of Krakow in 1946. In Germany, they fight with the bourgeois whenever it acts in a revolutionary way, against the absolute monarchy, the feudal squirery, and the petty bourgeoisie. But they never cease for a single instant to instill into the working class the clearest possible recognition of the hostile antagonism between bourgeoisie and proletariat, in order that the German workers may straightway use as so many weapons against the bourgeoisie the social and political conditions that the bourgeoisie must necessarily introduce along with its supremacy, and in order that, after the fall of the reactionary classes in Germany, the fight against the bourgeoisie itself may immediately begin. The communists turn their attention chiefly to Germany because in that country is on the eve of bourgeois revolution that is bound to be carried out under more advanced conditions of European civilization, and with a much more developed proletariat than that of England was in the 17th and France in the 18th century, and because of the bourgeois revolution in Germany will be but the prelude to an immediately following proletarian revolution. In short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. In all of these movements, they bring to the front, as leading question in each, the property question, no matter what its degree of development at the time. Finally, they labor everywhere for the union and agreement of the democratic parties of all countries. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions, letting the ruling classes tremble at the communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. All right, so that concludes the main part. I'm going to read some of the extra stuff at the back. So here is Letter from Engels to Marx, 24 November 1847. So, Paris, 23 to 24 November 1847. Dear Marx, not until this evening was it decided that I should be coming. Saturday evening, then, in Ostend, Hotel de la Couronne, just opposite the railway station beside the harbor, and Sunday morning across the water. If you take the train that leaves between 4 and 5, you will arrive at about the same time I do, Tuesday evening. Give a little thought to the quote-unquote confession of faith. I think we would do best to abandon the catechetical form and call the thing quote-unquote Communist Manifesto, since a certain amount of history has to be narrated in it. The form hitherto adopted is quite unsuitable. I shall be bringing with me the one from here, which I did quote-unquote Principles of Communism. It is in a simple narrative form, but wretchedly worded in a tearing hurry. I start off by asking, what is communism? And then straight on to the proletariat, the history of its origins, and how it differs from earlier workers. The development of the antithesis between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, crises, conclusions. In between, all kinds of secondary matter, and finally the Communist Party policy, insofar as it should be made public. The one here has not yet been submitted in its entirety for endorsement, but save for a few quite minor points, I think I can get it through in such a form that at least there is nothing in it which conflicts with our views. Okay, and so here is a draft of a Communist Confession of Faith. This document is the draft program discussed at the First Congress of the Communist League in London on June 2nd to 9th, 1847. The Congress was a final stage in the reorganization of the League of the Just, an organization of German workers and craftsmen, which was founded in Paris in the 1936-37 and soon acquired an international character. Having communities in Germany, France, Switzerland, Britain, and Sweden, the activity of Marx and Engels, directed towards the ideological and organizational unity of socialists and advanced workers, prompted the leaders of the League, Karl Schnapper, Joseph Moll, Heinrich Bauer, who resided in London Front November 1846, to ask for their help in reorganizing the League and drafting its new program, Me. When Marx and Engels were convinced that their leaders of the League of the Just were ready to accept the principles of scientific communism as its program, they accepted the offer to join the League made them late in January 1847. Engels' active participation in the work of the Congress, Marx was unable to go to London, affected the course and the results of its proceedings. The League was renamed the Communist League. The old motto of the League of the Just, quote-unquote, all men are brothers, was replaced by a new one, Marxist one, quote-unquote, working men of all countries unite. The draft program and the draft rules of the League were approved at the last sitting on June 9, 1847. The full text of the draft of the Communist Confession of Faith became known only in 1968. It was first found by the Swiss scholar Bert Andreas, together with the draft rules and circular of the First Congress, to the member of the League in the archives of Joachim Friedrich Martens, an active member of the Communist League, which are kept in the State and University Library in Hamburg. This discovery made it possible to ascertain a number of important points in the history of the Communist League and the drafting of its program documents. It had been previously assumed that the First Congress did no more than adopt a decision to draw a program, and that the draft itself was made by the London Central Authority of the Communist League. After Congress between June and August 1847, the new documents show that the draft was ready by June 9, 1847, and that its author was Engels. The document testifies to Engels' great influence on the discussion of the program at the Congress. The formation of the answers to most of the questions is a Marxist one. Besides While drafting the program, Engels had to take into account that the members of the League had not yet freed themselves from the influence of utopian ideas, and this was reflected in the formulation of the first 6 question and answers. The form of quote-unquote revolutionary catechism was also commonly used in the League of the Just and other organization of workers and craftsmen at the time. It may he assumed that Engels intended to give greater precision to some of the formulations of the program document in the course of further discussion and revision. After the first Congress of the Communist League, the quote-unquote draft of a Communist Confession of Faith was sent together with the draft rules to the communities for discussion, the results of which were to be taken into account at the time of the final approval of the program and the rules at the Second Congress. When working on another, improved draft program, The Principles of Communism, in late October 1847, Engels made direct use of the quote-unquote Confession of Faith, as can be seen from the coincidences of the text and also from references in the Principles to the earlier document when Engels had apparently decided to leave the formulation of some of the answers as they were. Okay, so now we're getting into a communist confession of faith. Question 1, are you a communist? Answer, yes. Question 2, what is the aim of the communists? Answer, to organize a society in such a way that every member of it could develop and use all his capabilities and powers in complete freedom and without thereby infringing the basic conditions of this society. Question 3. How do you wish to achieve this aim? Answer, by the elimination of private property and its replacement by community of property. Question 4. On what do you base your community of property? Answer, firstly, on the mass of productive forces and means of subsistence resulting from the development of industry, agriculture, trade, and colonization, and on the possibility inherent in machinery, chemical, and other resources of their infinite extension. Secondly, on the fact that in the consciousness or feeling of every individual there exists certain irrefutable basic principles which, being the result of the whole historical development, require no proof. Question 5. What are such principles? Answer. For example, every individual strives to be happy. The happiness of the individual is inseparable from the happiness of all, etc. Question 6. How do you wish to prepare the way for your community of property? Answer. By enlightening and uniting the proletariat. Question 7. What is the proletariat? Answer. The proletariat is that class of society which lives exclusively by its labor and not on the profit from any kind of capital. That class whose weal and woe, whose life and death, therefore, depend on the alternation of times of good and bad business. In a word, on the fluctuations of competition. Question 8. Then there have not always been proletarians? Answer. No. There have always been poor and working classes, and those who worked were almost always the poor, but there have not always been proletarians, just as competition has not always been free. Question 9. How did the proletariat arise? Answer. The proletariat came into being as a result of the introduction of the machines, which have been invented since the middle of the last century, and the most important of which are the steam engine, the spinning machine, and the power loom. These machines, which were very expensive and could therefore be purchased by only be purchased by rich people, supplanted the workers of the time because by the use of machinery it was possible to produce commodities more quickly and cheaply than could the workers with their imperfect spinning wheels and hand looms. The machines thus delivered industry entirely into the hands of the big capitalist and rendered the workers scanty property, which consisted mainly of their tools, looms, etc., quite worthless, so that the capitalist was left with everything, the worker was left with nothing. In this way the factory system was introduced. Once the capitalists saw how advantageous this was for them, They sought to extend it to more and more branches of labor. They divided work more and more between the workers so that the workers who had formerly had made a whole article now produced only a part of it. Labor was simplified in this way, produced goods more quickly and therefore more cheaply, and only now was it found in almost every branch of labor that here also machines could be used. As soon as any branch of labor went over to factory production, it ended up, just as in the case of the spinning wheel and weaving, in the hands of big capitalists, and workers were deprived of the last remnants of their independence. We have gradually arrived at the position where almost all branches of labor are run on factory basis. This has increasingly brought about the ruin of previously existing middle class, especially of the small master craftsmen, completely transformed the previous position of the workers, and two new classes which are gradually swallowing up all other classes have become into being, namely, first, the class of the big capitalists, who in all advanced countries are in almost exclusive possession of the means of subsistence, and those means, in brackets, machines, factories, workshops, etc., by which those means of subsistence are produced. This is the bourgeois class, or the bourgeoisie. And second, the class of the completely propertyless, who are compelled to sell their labor to the first class, the bourgeois, simply to attain them in return by their means of subsistence. Since the parties to this trading in labor are not equal, but the bourgeois have the advantage, the propertyless must submit to the bad conditions laid down by the bourgeois. This class, dependent on the bourgeois, is called the class of the proletarians, or the proletariat. Question 10. In what way does the proletarian differ from the slave? Answer. The slave is sold once and for all. The proletarian has to sell himself by the day and by the hour. The slave is the property of one master, and for that very reason has guaranteed subsistence. However wretched it may be, the proletarian is, so to speak, the slave of the entire bourgeois class, not of one master, and therefore has no guaranteed subsistence, since nobody buys his labor if he does not need it. The slave is accounted a thing, and not a member of society. The proletarian is recognized as a person, as a member of society. The slave may, therefore, have better subsistence than the proletarian, but the latter stands at a higher stage of development. The slave frees himself by becoming a proletarian, abolishing from the totality of property relations the only relationship of slavery. The proletarian can free himself only by abolishing property in general. Question 11. In what way does the proletarian differ from the serf? Answer. The serf has the use of a piece of land, that is, of an instrument of production, in return for handing over a greater or lesser portion of the yield. The proletarian works with the instrument of production which belongs to someone else, who, in return for his labor, hands over to him a portion determined by competition of the products. In the case of the serf, the share of the laborer is determined by his own labor, and that is, by himself. In the case of the proletarian, it is determined by competition, therefore, in the first place, by the bourgeois. The serf has guaranteed subsistence, the proletarian has not. The serf frees himself by driving out his feudal lord and becoming a property owner himself, thus entering into competition and joining for the time being the possessing class, the privileged class. The proletarian frees himself by doing away with property, competition, and all class differences. Question 12. In what way does the proletarian differ from the handicraftsman? Answer. As opposed to the proletarian, the so-called handicraftsman, who still existed nearly everywhere during the last century and still exists here and there, is at most a temporary proletarian. His aim is to acquire capital himself and so to exploit other workers. He can often achieve this aim where the craft guilds still exists, or where freedom to follow trade has not yet led to the organization of handiwork on a factory basis and to the intense competition. But as soon as the factory system is introduced into handiwork and competition is in full swing, this prospect is eliminated and the handicraftsman becomes more and more a proletarian. The handicraftsman, therefore, frees himself either by becoming bourgeois or in general passing over into the middle class, or by becoming a proletarian as a result of competition, and now happens in most cases, and joining the movement of the proletariat, i.e. the more or less conscious communist movement. Question 13. Then you do not believe that the community of property has been possible at any time? Answer: no. Communism has only arisen since machinery and other inventions made it possible to hold out the prospect of an all-sided development, a happy existence for all members of society. Communism is a theory of liberation which was not possible for the slaves, for the serfs, or the handicraftsmen, but only for the proletarians, and hence it belongs of necessity to the 19th century and was not possible in any earlier period. Question 14. Let M go back to the sixth question. As you wish to prepare for a community of property by enlightening and uniting proletariat, then you reject revolution? Answer: we are convinced not only of the uselessness, but even of the harmfulness of all conspiracies. We are also aware that revolutions are not made deliberately and arbitrarily, but that everywhere and all times they are the necessary consequence of circumstances which are not in any way whatever dependent either on will or on the leadership of individual parties or of whole classes. But we see that the development of the proletariat in almost all countries of the world is forcibly repressed by the possessing classes, and that thus a revolution is being forcibly worked for by the opponents of communism. If, in the end, the oppressed proletariat is thus driven into revolution, then we will defend the cause of the proletariat just as well by our deeds and now by our words. Question 15. Do you intend to replace the existing social order by community of property at one stroke? Answer: we have no such intention. The development of the masses cannot hereby ordered by decree. It is determined by the development of the conditions in which these masses live, and therefore proceed gradually. Question 16. How do you think the transition from the present situation to community of property is to be effected? Answer: the first fundamental condition for the introduction of community of property is the political liberation of the proletariat through a democratic constitution. Question 17. What will be your first measure once you have established democracy? Answer: guaranteeing the subsistence of the proletariat. Question 18. How will you do this? Answer 1. By limiting private property in such a way that it gradually prepares the way for its transformation into social property, example, by progressive taxation, limitation of the right of inheritance in favor of the state, etc., etc. 2. By employing workers in national workshops and factories and on national estates. And 3. By educating all children at the expense of the state. Question 19. How will you arrange this kind of education during the period of transition? Answer: all children will be educated in state establishment from the time when they can do without the first maternal care. Question 20. Will not the introduction of a community of property be accompanied by the proclamation of the community of women? Answer: by no means. We will only interfere in the personal relationship between men and women or with the family in general to the extent that the maintenance of the existing institution would disturb the new social order. Besides, we are well aware that the family relationship has been modified in the course of history by the property relations and by periods of development, and that consequently the ending of private property will also have a most important influence on it. Question 21. will nationalities continue to exist under communism? The nationalities of all the people who join together according to the principle of community will be just as much compelled by this union to merge with one another and thereby supersede themselves as the various differences between estates and classes disappear throughout superseding of their basis private property. Question 22. Do communists reject existing religions? Answer. All religions which have existed hitherto were expressions of historical stages of development of individual peoples or groups of peoples. But communism is that stage of historical development which makes all existing religions superfluous and supersedes them. In the name and on the mandate of the Congress, Secretary Heidi alias of William Wolfe in the League of the Just, President Carl Schill, alias of Karl Schopper in the League of the Just, London, June 9th, 1847. So this is where I'll leave this off. There is more, about 28 pages of extra stuff. Let me know if you want that, but I think this is good for now.